Imagine this. Before he was the first president of the United States, George Washington was a young man who actually wanted to become a British officer. Hard to believe, right? The man we now call the father of the nation, once fought under the very flag America would later rebel against. But how did a loyal British subject transform into the leader of a revolution, and eventually the symbol of freedom itself? And what surprising truths about Washington's life are often left out of the textbooks? Stick around, because the answers may challenge what you thought you knew. When we think of George Washington, most of us picture the dignified first president, the man on the dollar bill, a symbol of strength and unity. But Washington's story didn't start in the White House. He grew up on the edges of the Virginia frontier, shaped by both opportunity and struggle. Early on, he wasn't a polished statesman. He was a young surveyor, a soldier, and at times, a man learning through failure as much as through victory. What makes Washington so fascinating to revisit today isn't just his legendary role in founding America, it's the transformation that took him from a loyal subject of Britain to the commander-in-chief of a revolution that changed the world. This journey, with all its contradictions, raises the question, how did an ordinary man of his era rise to become an extraordinary figure in history? In this video, we're going to break down Washington's evolution step by step, looking at his leadership, his choices, and even his flaws, so you can see not just the polished image, but the real person behind the legend. And by the end, you might discover a George Washington you've never known before. George Washington's rise wasn't a straight line to greatness, it was a winding road filled with trials, doubts, and bold decisions that often could have ended in disaster. Imagine a young officer in the British Army, barely in his 20s, trying to prove himself on the unforgiving battlefields of the French and Indian War. Washington's first real taste of command. It ended in surrender. He even signed a document, written in French, that mistakenly admitted to an assassination he hadn't committed. For many, that would have been the end of a career. For Washington, it was only the beginning. What's fascinating here is how each setback seemed to sharpen his edge. He became known not for his flawless victories, because he didn't have many early on, but for his resilience, his ability to adapt, and his willingness to learn the hard way. Those traits would later define him when the stakes were far higher. Fast forward to the Revolutionary War, and you see Washington in a completely different light. He wasn't the most experienced general on the field, nor was he leading the best-equipped army. In fact, the Continental Army was underfed, undertrained, and constantly short on supplies. Yet somehow, Washington kept them together. How? Through a kind of steady determination that inspired loyalty, even when everything around him screamed defeat. Think of the winter at Valley Forge, freezing conditions, scarce food, and crumbling morale. Most leaders would have watched their army dissolve. Washington turned it into a crucible of endurance, a place where ragged volunteers transformed into soldiers capable of challenging the world's most powerful empire. But Washington's rising action wasn't just about grit on the battlefield. It was also about knowing when not to fight. Unlike some generals driven by glory, he often chose retreat or delay if it meant preserving his army for another day. That patience frustrated allies at times, but it's what kept the revolution alive. And here's where his true strength shines. He understood that winning wasn't about dramatic victories, it was about survival, persistence, and timing. Of course, not everything about Washington was heroic. He was a man of contradictions. He owned enslaved people while leading a fight for liberty, and he struggled with ambition even as he claimed to shun power. These tensions add depth to his story, reminding us he wasn't a flawless marble statue but a deeply human figure navigating the complexities of his time. And then there's the ultimate twist in his rise. When the war was finally won, Washington did something almost no victorious leader in history had done before. He gave up power. Instead of seizing control like so many generals throughout history, he stepped back and returned to civilian life. That act stunned the world and set a precedent for the democracy we know today. But here's the real question. Was Washington's restraint a sign of pure selflessness, or was it another strategic move that cemented his legacy forever? Stick with me, because in the next section we'll break down his biggest highlights and deepest flaws, and some of them might surprise you. The true climax of George Washington's story came not on the battlefield, but in the quiet halls of power after victory. Imagine it. The colonies had won their freedom, Washington stood as the most respected man in America, and the people would have followed him anywhere, even into kingship. In fact, whispers of crowning him a monarch were already circulating. This was the ultimate test of character. History is full of generals who seized power the moment they had the chance. Washington, he stunned the world by walking away. In December 1783, he entered the State House in Annapolis, handed over his commission, and stepped down as commander-in-chief. No fanfare, no personal throne, just a deliberate act of humility. King George III, when told Washington had surrendered power, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." And he did. This moment was more than symbolic, it was revolutionary in its own right. Washington proved that America's future would not be built on the rule of a single man, but on principles of shared governance. He had every chance to grab absolute authority, and instead, he chose restraint. That choice became the turning point of his legacy. It wasn't just that he led an army to victory, it was that he showed the world a new model of leadership, power used for the people, not for personal gain. But here's where the story sharpens. Was Washington's act truly one of selfless virtue, or was it the most brilliant legacy move any leader has ever made? That question still divides historians, and it's exactly what makes his story so compelling. Next, we'll weigh his greatest strengths against his deepest flaws to see whether Washington's reputation as the indispensable man really holds up. So, after walking through the triumphs, the struggles, and the contradictions of George Washington's life, what's the final verdict? Washington was not a flawless hero carved in stone. He was a man of resilience, vision, and restraint, whose imperfections only make his achievements more remarkable. His greatest strength wasn't just leading armies or drafting strategies, it was knowing when to let go of power, proving that leadership is defined as much by humility as by strength. On the pro side, Washington's ability to inspire loyalty, his patience in the face of impossible odds, and his decision to step away from power laid the foundation for the democracy we live in today. Without those choices, America could easily have become just another nation ruled by a war hero turned dictator. On the con side, his ownership of enslaved people and his occasional indecisiveness remind us that he was still a man of his era. Carrying the flaws and contradictions of 18th century America, that's an important reminder. Heroes can be inspiring without being perfect. Who is Washington's story for? If you're someone who believes leadership should be about vision, patience, and integrity rather than flashy victories, his legacy resonates deeply. If you're drawn to history for its gray areas, where ideals clash with human weakness, then Washington's life offers lessons that feel surprisingly relevant today. And here's the impact. In a world where leaders still wrestle with ambition and power, Washington's example of walking away may be more revolutionary now than it was in 1783. His legacy isn't just written in textbooks, it's a challenge to every generation. What will we do with the power we hold? So, what do you think? Was Washington truly that indispensable man, or have we polished his image too much over time? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you found this breakdown eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves history as much as you do.